The wind screamed through the mountain pass with a force that could knock a grown man off his feet, and Elena Marsh gripped the frozen rope line with both hands, fighting to stay upright as ice needles cut across her face. She had left the village 3 hours ago with a simple task: to check on the old shepherd's hut before the storm sealed the pass for the winter, and now the storm had arrived early and full of rage. Snow fell so thick she could not see her own boots. Every breath burned her throat. She should have turned back an hour ago, she knew that now. Her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, and her legs shook with the effort of pushing through snow that reached her knees in some places, and her waist in others. The wind did not blow in one direction. It came from everywhere at once, spinning around the rocks, throwing her sideways, forcing her to lean into gusts that felt like solid walls. She thought of her grandmother's warnings about mountain storms, how they killed travelers every single year, how the cold worked slowly and quietly until a person simply lay down and never got up again. She was not going to lie down. She had promised herself that when she left the house that morning, and she repeated it now, like a prayer. One more step, then another. The shepherd's hut had to be close. She had walked this path 100 times in summer, when the rocks were warm and the grass was green, and none of this seemed possible. Now every landmark had vanished under white. A sound reached her through the wind, faint and strange, almost lost beneath the roar of the storm. She stopped and turned her head, straining to hear it again. It came a second time, low and pained, somewhere off to her left where the rocks rose into a cliff face. It was not the wind. It was not any sound she had heard before. Something alive was out there, and it was suffering. Every instinct told her to keep moving toward shelter. The hut was close. Her own life was already hanging by a thread in this weather, and stopping now to search for the source of a sound could cost her everything. But she had never been able to walk past something in pain, not since she was a child pulling injured birds out of the road, not since she had spent years nursing sick lambs back to health, when other people would have simply let them die. She turned toward the sound instead of away from it. The snow near the rocks was disturbed, churned up as though something large had dragged itself through it. She followed the trail, her heart pounding harder with every step, until she reached a narrow gap between two boulders, where the wind briefly eased. And there, half buried in red-stained snow, lay the largest wolf she had ever seen. Its body was the size of a horse, dark gray fur matted with blood along one flank, one leg twisted at an angle that made her stomach turn. Its ribs rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Steam rose from an open wound near its shoulder, a wound that looked wrong somehow. The flesh around it blackened in a way no ordinary injury should cause. The animal's eyes were open, gold and glassy, fixed on her with an expression that looked almost like a plea. Elena had grown up around animals her whole life, had helped her father with the family's small farm since she was old enough to walk, but she had never seen a wolf anywhere near this size, and she had never seen an injury like this one. Every rational thought in her head told her this was dangerous, that wolves this large could kill a person with one bite, that she should back away slowly and leave it to whatever fate the mountain had decided for it. But the animal did not move to attack her. It barely seemed able to move at all. Its breathing grew shallower as she watched, and something in its golden eyes held her in place instead of sending her running. She thought about walking away. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she was already moving toward it, pulling off her outer coat despite the biting cold, because leaving any living thing to freeze to death when she had the power to help was simply not something she was capable of doing. The wolf did not growl when she knelt beside it. It watched her with those glassy eyes, its enormous chest rising and falling in short, desperate breaths, and when she laid her coat over the worst of the wound, it made a sound low in its throat that was almost like relief. Up close, the wound was even more disturbing than she had first thought. The edges of the injury were not torn the way a claw or tooth mark would look. They were burned, almost melted, as if something unnatural had caused this damage. She had no idea what could do this to an animal this size, and she had no time to wonder about it, because the storm was worsening by the minute, and the wolf was losing blood fast. The shepherd's hut stood maybe 200 meters further up the slope, half hidden behind a ridge of rock. There was no possible way she could carry an animal this large through waist-deep snow in a blizzard, but she also could not simply leave it here to die alone in the cold. She thought quickly, scanning the rocks for anything useful. and found a shallow cave mouth just a few steps further along the cliff face. Barely more than an overhang, but enough to break the worst of the wind. It would have to do. She could not reach the hut with the wolf, but she might be able to drag it those few meters to shelter. Getting the animal to move was the hardest physical task Elena had ever attempted. She wedged her shoulder beneath its uninjured side, wrapped her arms as far around its massive frame as she could manage, and pulled with every ounce of strength her body had left after hours of fighting through snow. The wolf tried weakly to help, pushing with its good legs, but every movement clearly cost it enormous pain. Elena spoke to it the whole time. Quiet words meant more to steady her own nerves than to comfort the animal, telling it to hold on, telling it they were almost there, telling it she was not going to let it die in the snow. It took nearly 20 minutes to move the wolf, those 200 meters. 20 minutes that felt like hours. 20 minutes during which her muscles screamed, and her lungs burned from the thin, cold air and the effort. But finally she pulled the wolf beneath the rock overhang, out of the direct wind, into a space barely large enough for both of them. She collapsed beside it, gasping, her whole body trembling from exhaustion and cold. There was no time to rest. She knew that if she stopped moving for too long in this weather, her own body heat would drop to dangerous levels. She gathered what dry brush and dead branches she could find within reach of the overhang, her fingers clumsy with cold, and used the small fire starter kit her father always insisted she carry into the mountains. It took 4 attempts before the flame caught, shielded by her body from the worst of the wind. But finally a small fire began to grow, and warmth, blessed warmth, began to fill the little space. The wolf's breathing had grown even more shallow. Elena examined the wound more closely in the firelight, and what she saw made her frown in confusion. Small dark fragments were embedded around the edges of the burn, metallic-looking, and the flesh around them had turned an unhealthy gray color that was spreading slowly outward from the wound. She had tended enough sick and injured animals to know that whatever this was, it was not a normal infection. It was something poisoning the wolf from the inside, something that was killing it faster than the blood loss alone would have. She did not have medical training beyond basic farm knowledge and instinct, but she understood one thing clearly. If those fragments stayed in the wound, the wolf would not survive the night. Her hands shook as she considered what she would have to do next. She tore strips from her scarf and boiled a small amount of snowmelt over the fire in her metal cup, sterilizing it as best she could with the limited tools she carried. Then, murmuring words of comfort to an animal that could kill her with a single bite if it lost patience with the pain she was about to cause, she began carefully removing the metal fragments with the tip of her small knife. The wolf let out a sound of pain so raw it made her flinch, but it did not attack her. It lay still, trembling, allowing her hands near its most vulnerable and dangerous wound, and something about that trust settled deep into her chest, even as fear kept every nerve in her body on edge. One by one she drew the fragments out, setting them aside on a flat stone, watching as dark fluid seeped from each small wound she created in the process of trying to save its life. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold the knife steady anymore. The fire crackled beside them, casting orange light across the cave walls and across the massive gray form of the wolf, whose breathing had steadied slightly now that the fragments were gone. Elena wrapped the wound as best she could with the remaining strips of her scarf, then sat back against the cold stone wall, utterly spent. Outside, the blizzard raged on without mercy, howling past the mouth of their small shelter like something alive and furious. Elena pulled her knees to her chest, keeping close to the fire, watching the great wolf's chest rise and fall in the firelight. She had no idea if what she had done would be enough. She had no idea if the wolf would wake in the morning, calm and grateful, or wake in a panic and see her only as a threat to be destroyed. She had no idea, really, why she had risked everything to save a creature that could easily have killed her the moment she came near it. But as she watched its breathing slowly even out, as she watched the tension in its enormous body ease into something closer to rest, she felt something she could not quite name settle over her, a strange certainty that she had done the right thing, whatever came next. The storm would not break until morning at the earliest. She had no way to reach the village, no way to call for help, nothing to do but sit through the long, freezing night beside a dying wolf, and hope that her small fire and her small efforts would be enough to keep them both alive until dawn. She thought about her father, who would be pacing the kitchen floor by now, worried sick that she had not returned before the storm sealed the pass. She thought about her mother, who always told her that her heart was too big for her own good, that one day her instinct to help every wounded thing she came across would put her in real danger. Elena had always laughed those warnings off. Tonight, trapped in a freezing cave with a creature large enough to end her life in seconds, she wondered if her mother had been right all along. And yet, even as fear and exhaustion pulled at her, she found she did not regret it. She reached out, hesitant, and rested one hand lightly on the wolf's uninjured shoulder, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of its breathing beneath her palm. The fur was coarse and cold at the tips, but warm closer to the skin, and the simple, living reality of that warmth against her hand felt like the only solid thing left in a world gone white and howling around them. The fire burned low sometime near midnight, and Elena forced her stiff, aching body to move, gathering the last of the dry branches within reach to keep the flames alive. Her eyelids grew heavy despite the danger of sleeping in such cold, and she fought against exhaustion by counting her own breaths, by watching the wolf's chest continue its slow rise and fall, by reminding herself over and over that morning would come, and the storm would break, and somehow, some way, she would find a path back down to the village. At some point past midnight, the wolf's golden eyes opened again, meeting hers across the dying firelight. For a long moment neither of them moved. Elena held perfectly still, uncertain whether the animal recognized her as the one who had helped it, or simply as prey too tired to run. But the wolf did not growl, did not tense to attack. It simply watched her, its breathing steady now, its great head resting against the stone floor of the cave, and something passed between them in that silent exchange that Elena would spend a long time afterward trying to understand. She did not know in that moment that the creature watching her with such quiet, intense focus was no ordinary wolf at all. She did not know that somewhere beneath that massive gray form was a man of immense power, a king among his kind, whose life she had just saved through nothing but stubborn compassion and a refusal to walk past suffering when she had the strength to ease it. She only knew that the wolf was alive, that the storm outside was finally beginning to weaken, and that whatever strange bond had formed between them in this freezing shelter felt like something she would never be able to fully explain. Sleep did not come easily, even with exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. Elena drifted in and out, jolted awake each time the wind changed pitch outside the cave mouth, each time a loose stone shifted somewhere on the cliff above them. In one of those half-waking moments, she thought she heard another sound beneath the wind, a distant howl, low and mournful, carried across the mountain from somewhere far away. The wolf beside her stirred at the sound, its ears twitching, a low rumble building in its chest that was not quite a growl, but was not calm either. Elena held her breath, watching the tension ripple through the great animal's body, wondering for the first time since she had found it whether more of its kind might be searching for it, and whether they would see her as a friend or as a threat standing between them and their own. The howl did not come again. Whatever had made the sound seemed to move on, fading into the vast white silence of the storm, and slowly the tension eased out of the wolf's body until it settled once more into steady, sleeping breaths. Elena let her own breath out slowly, her heart still racing, and added the last of her dry branches to the fire, watching the small flames catch and steady. She had never felt so far from home, so completely alone with something wild and unknowable, and yet strangely, she did not feel afraid of the wolf itself anymore. She felt afraid of everything else, the storm, the cold, the unknown dangers of the mountain at night, but not of the creature breathing steadily beside her. She thought about the fragments she had pulled from the wound, small and dark and metallic, resting now on the flat stone where she had set them aside. In the weak firelight she picked one up and turned it between her fingers, studying it. It did not look like any hunting shot she had ever seen used in the village, and the way the flesh around the wound had blackened and poisoned outward told her this was not an ordinary injury from an ordinary weapon. Someone, or something, had wanted this wolf dead in a very particular way, and had very nearly succeeded. She set the fragment back down, unable to make sense of it, and turned her attention back to the fire. The hours crawled by in that strange, suspended way that only happens in the deep of night, when a person is too exhausted to think clearly, and too frightened to fully rest. Elena found herself talking quietly to the wolf again, not because she expected it to understand her, but because the sound of her own voice helped keep the creeping edges of panic at bay. She told it about her village, tucked into the valley below the mountain, about her father's small farm, and the sheep she had raised from lambs, about her mother's warnings, and her own stubborn refusal to ever listen to them when an animal was suffering nearby. She told it that she did not know if either of them would survive until morning, but that she intended to try. At some point, exhaustion finally won out over fear, and Elena's eyes grew too heavy to keep open any longer. She banked what remained of the fire carefully, tucked her hands beneath her arms for warmth, and allowed herself to drift into a shallow, uneasy sleep, her back pressed against the cold stone wall, and her body angled toward the wolf's warmth. She woke twice more before dawn, once to the sound of ice cracking somewhere on the cliff face above, and once to find that the wolf had indeed shifted closer to her in its sleep, its great head now resting only a short distance from her knee, its breathing slow and even, no longer the shallow gasping of the night before. Each time she woke, she checked the wound beneath her makeshift bandages, relieved to find no fresh bleeding, relieved to see that the terrible gray discoloration in the surrounding flesh had not spread any further. Whatever she had done, pulling those strange fragments free, cleaning the wound as best she could with boiled snowmelt, seemed to be working. The wolf was not out of danger, not by any measure, but it was no longer actively dying in front of her, and that alone felt like the greatest victory of her life. By the time the sky beyond the cave mouth began to lighten from black to the deep blue-gray of early dawn, the wind outside had finally begun to lose some of its earlier fury. The relentless howling softened into something more like ordinary mountain wind, still cold and sharp, but no longer trying to tear the world apart. Elena allowed herself a small, exhausted flicker of hope. If the storm was truly breaking, there was a chance, however small, that she might be able to find her way back down toward the village once there was enough light to see the path. She did not want to leave the wolf. That thought surprised her when it surfaced, clear and certain, cutting through the fog of exhaustion. She barely knew this creature, had spent only a single terrifying, exhausting night beside it, and yet some part of her recoiled at the idea of walking away and leaving it here alone, still weak, still recovering, with no one to watch over it, or keep the fire going, or make sure the wound did not turn bad again. She pushed the thought aside as impractical. She had her own survival to think about, her own family waiting anxiously for her return. She could not stay in this cave forever, and the wolf, whatever strange bond had formed between them in the darkness, was still a wild animal that belonged to the mountain, not to her. As the first pale gray light of dawn began to creep along the horizon, faint and far off beyond the mouth of the cave, Elena finally allowed her exhausted body to rest properly, for the first time since she had found the wolf bleeding in the snow, curling close to the fading fire, one hand still resting on the wolf's steady, breathing side. She had no idea what the coming morning would bring. She only knew that she had done everything within her power to keep this creature alive through the longest, coldest night of her life, and as sleep finally pulled her under completely, the last thing she felt was the wolf shifting almost imperceptibly closer to her for warmth, as though even in its weakened state, some part of it understood exactly what she had done, and was not willing to let her go. Elena woke to silence, not the ringing, empty silence of shock, but real silence, the kind that only comes after a storm has finally exhausted itself and moved on. She blinked against the pale light filling the cave mouth, and pushed herself upright, every muscle in her body protesting the movement, after a night spent curled against cold stone. For one disoriented moment she forgot where she was, forgot everything, except the ache in her back and the dryness in her throat. Then her eyes found the wolf, and memory came rushing back all at once. Except it was not a wolf lying beside her anymore. Elena froze, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. Where the massive gray wolf had been, there was now a man, unconscious, lying on his side, with the same bandages she had wrapped around the wolf's wound, now wrapped around a human shoulder, the same position, the same steady breathing, the same terrible burned wound still visible beneath the edge of the cloth. He was enormous, tall and powerfully built, even collapsed and unconscious on the cave floor, with dark hair damp against his forehead, and skin that looked pale from blood loss. Elena stared at him, absolutely certain for several long seconds that she had lost her mind sometime during the night. She scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the stone wall, putting as much distance between them as the small cave allowed, her mind racing through every possible explanation, and finding none of them satisfying. She had not imagined the wolf. She had felt its fur under her hands, had cleaned its wound, had listened to its breathing through the long hours of darkness. And yet here, in the exact same spot, was a man, breathing in the exact same rhythm, wounded in the exact same place. Her first instinct was to run. The storm had broken, the pass would be treacherous but passable, and every rational part of her screamed that she should leave this cave immediately, and not look back, that whatever she had witnessed was beyond her understanding, and possibly beyond her safety, but her legs would not move. She sat frozen against the stone, watching the stranger's chest rise and fall, unable to look away, unable to make sense of what her own eyes were telling her. Minutes passed. The man did not stir. Elena forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the impossible scene in front of her. She thought of old stories her grandmother used to tell by the fire in winter, stories of creatures that walked as beasts under one sky, and as men under another, stories she had always dismissed as tales meant to frighten children into staying close to home after dark. She had never believed them. She was not entirely sure she believed this either, except that the evidence lay directly in front of her, undeniable and breathing. She noticed, with a jolt, that his eyes were beginning to move beneath closed lids, his brow furrowing slightly, as consciousness crept back toward him. Elena's whole body tensed. She had no idea what kind of creature this man truly was, no idea whether he would wake calm or dangerous, whether he would remember the night before at all, or whether he would see her only as a stranger who had somehow ended up far too close to him while he was at his most vulnerable. His eyes opened slowly, and Elena found herself looking into a gaze so sharp and alert it seemed impossible that moments before he had been unconscious. His eyes were a striking shade of amber gold, the exact color, she realized with a chill, of the wolf's eyes the night before. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved. He studied her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back further against the wall, his gaze moving from her face to the makeshift fire pit, to the strips of torn scarf still wrapped around his shoulder, to the small metal fragments still resting on the flat stone where she had placed them the night before. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough from disuse, but carried an unmistakable authority that seemed strange, coming from a man who had been unconscious and bleeding only moments before. He asked her, simply, what she had done to him. Elena's throat felt too dry to answer at first. She swallowed hard and forced words out, explaining haltingly that she had found a wolf, badly injured, in the snow near the cliff, that she had dragged it to shelter and cleaned its wound, and removed strange metal fragments she did not understand, that she had spent the night keeping a fire going to keep them both from freezing. She left out the part about watching the transformation happen, uncertain whether saying it aloud would make it feel more or less real. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way a person might study a puzzle that refused to make sense. Then he asked whether she understood what she had seen. Elena admitted, honestly, that she did not really, but that she had eyes, and she knew what she had watched happen just before dawn. She braced herself for anger, for denial, for some kind of dangerous reaction to being caught in whatever secret he clearly carried. Instead, something in his expression shifted, and he let out a slow breath, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wound. He told her his name was Kale, and that she had saved his life in more ways than she likely understood. He explained, carefully and without much elaboration, that he was not entirely human, that his kind lived hidden among the mountains and forests, and that the wound she had treated had not been an ordinary injury, but a deliberate attempt on his life, using a substance that was, to creatures like him, a deadly poison. Without her intervention, he told her plainly, he would not have survived the night. Elena sat with that information for a long moment, turning it over in her mind, waiting for the fear to arrive in full force. It did not come the way she expected. Instead, what she felt was closer to overwhelming curiosity, mixed with a lingering disbelief that refused to fully settle. She asked him what he meant by not entirely human, though some part of her already suspected the answer. He held her gaze steadily and told her the truth, plainly, without softening it. He was a Lycan, one of an ancient race capable of taking the form of a wolf, and not merely any Lycan, but the ruling king of his territory, ambushed the day before by enemies who had used silver, poisoned and refined into a weapon specifically designed to kill his kind, hoping to end his life and throw his lands into chaos. The word king settled strangely in the small cave, at odds with the exhausted, wounded man sitting across from her wrapped in her own torn scarf. Elena found herself searching his face for some sign that he was mocking her, testing her, but found only the same steady, serious expression he had worn since waking. She realized, with a growing unease, that he was telling her the complete truth, and that the truth was far larger and stranger than anything she had imagined when she first saw the wolf bleeding in the snow. Kale watched her carefully as she absorbed this, clearly reading the shock and confusion moving across her features. He told her, more gently than before, that he understood how impossible this must sound, and that under different circumstances, he would never have revealed any of it to a human. But she had already seen the transformation, had already treated wounds that no human should have survived treating without harm to herself, and there was little point pretending otherwise now. Elena asked, carefully, why the silver had not harmed her, given that she had pulled the fragments free with her bare hands, and even her knife. Kale's expression grew thoughtful at the question, as though something about her immunity troubled or intrigued him in a way he was not yet ready to explain. He told her only that it was fortunate, and that she should be grateful the poison had not been potent enough in its fragmented state to affect a human system the way it had nearly destroyed his. Something in the careful way he chose his words told Elena there was more to that answer than he was willing to share yet, but exhaustion, and the shock of the entire night, pressed down on her too heavily to push the matter further. She asked instead what would happen now, whether he intended to simply walk away once his strength returned, whether the enemies who had attacked him might still be searching for him in these mountains, and whether her own presence here, having witnessed all of this, put her in any kind of danger. Kale's expression darkened slightly at the question, and for the first time since waking, Elena saw something like genuine concern cross his features, though whether it was concern for himself or for her, she could not tell. He admitted that her involvement complicated things considerably, that his enemies would show no hesitation in eliminating a witness if they learned of her role in his survival, and that he could not, in good conscience, simply leave her to walk back down the mountain alone without some measure of protection until the danger to him had passed. Elena felt a fresh wave of fear at that admission, sharper and more immediate than anything she had felt facing the wolf itself the night before. She had come into these mountains to check on an old shepherd's hut and had somehow, through nothing more than an inability to walk past a suffering creature, entangled herself in a conflict involving kings and poisoned weapons and enemies who killed without hesitation. She thought of her father waiting anxiously in the village, of her ordinary, quiet life that had, in the span of a single night, become anything but ordinary. Kale seemed to read the fear on her face, and something in his manner softened slightly, though his voice remained steady and serious. He told her that he owed her a debt he did not intend to leave unpaid, and that whatever came next, he would not allow harm to come to her, because of what she had done for him. It was a promise made by a stranger she had known for less than a day, a stranger who was, by his own account, not even entirely human, and yet something in the unwavering certainty of his tone made Elena believe him, despite every reasonable instinct telling her she should not trust so easily. Outside the cave, the mountain lay quiet and white beneath a clearing sky. The storm's fury spent, the world transformed overnight into something new and unfamiliar, much like Elena's own understanding of what was possible had been transformed in the very same hours. She looked at the wounded stranger sitting across from her, at the amber eyes that still carried something wild and unknowable beneath their careful composure, and wondered exactly what kind of world she had stumbled into when she chose to follow the sound of a dying creature's cry into the storm. Kale tried to rise, testing the strength in his legs, and immediately Elena saw the effort cost him more than he wanted to admit. He swayed, one hand bracing against the cave wall, his jaw tightening against what she guessed was considerable pain. She moved without thinking, catching his arm to steady him, and felt beneath her palm the sheer solid weight of muscle that no ordinary man carried. He glanced down at her hand on his arm, something unreadable flickering across his face, then allowed himself to lower back down onto the stone floor, rather than push through the dizziness. He admitted, with visible reluctance, that his strength had not yet returned enough to attempt the descent, and that moving too soon could reopen the wound and undo everything her care through the night had accomplished. Elena felt a fresh wave of worry settle over her, worry not just for her own situation now but genuinely for his condition, an instinct she recognized from years of nursing injured farm animals back to health, the same stubborn refusal to let a patient push itself past what its body could safely bear. She busied herself checking the bandage again, relieved to find the wound had not reopened despite his attempt to stand, though the skin around it remained an unhealthy shade that worried her. Cale watched her work with quiet attention, and when she finished, he asked her plainly why she had done any of it, why a human woman would risk her own safety in a blizzard to save a wolf she had never seen before, when the wiser choice would have been to walk on and save herself. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. She told him she had never been able to walk past something suffering, not since she was small enough to carry injured birds home in her coat pockets, not through years of losing sleep over sick lambs that other farmers would have simply let die rather than waste the effort. She said it was not bravery, not really, just an inability to live with herself afterward if she had kept walking. Cale studied her for a long moment after she finished speaking, an expression crossing his features that she could not quite name, something between disbelief and quiet recognition. He told her that where he came from, such reckless compassion toward a stranger, let alone toward a wild and dangerous creature, was rare enough to be remarkable. Before Elena could ask what he meant by that, a distant sound reached them both at once, faint but unmistakable, carried on the thin mountain air. Voices, several of them, calling out across the slopes below, growing steadily closer. Cale's entire posture changed instantly, the exhaustion in his face replaced by sharp, focused alertness, his eyes narrowing toward the cave mouth. Elena's heart leapt into her throat, uncertain whether the approaching voices belonged to rescue or to the same enemies who had nearly killed him the night before, and from the sudden tension radiating off Cale beside her, she suspected he was just as uncertain as she was. Cale pressed a finger to his lips, motioning for Elena to stay low and silent, and despite every question racing through her mind, she obeyed instantly, pressing herself against the cave wall beside him. The voices grew closer, and now she could make out words carried on the wind, calls that sounded less like a hunting party searching for prey, and more like people searching urgently for a missing person. Cale's shoulders relaxed slightly at whatever he heard in the tone and cadence of the voices, though he did not fully lower his guard. He told her quietly that the voices belonged to his own people, members of his personal guard, who would have noticed his absence and begun searching the moment the storm allowed safe travel. Relief crossed his face, quickly followed by a flicker of something more complicated, an awareness, Elena guessed, that his rescuers arriving meant she was about to be pulled fully into a world she had only just glimpsed the edges of. Within minutes, 4 figures appeared at the base of the slope below the cave, moving with a speed and sure-footedness through the deep snow that struck Elena as unnatural, almost too fast and too graceful for ordinary men navigating treacherous terrain after a blizzard. As they drew closer, she saw they were dressed in dark, practical clothing, each carrying weapons at their sides, their eyes scanning the mountainside with sharp, alert focus. When they spotted the cave and the 2 figures within it, their pace increased, and Elena watched with growing unease as their expressions shifted from urgent search to something like shock and reverence the moment they recognized Cale. The tallest of the 4 reached the cave first, dropping to one knee the instant he was close enough, his head bowed, addressing Cale with a title that confirmed everything he had told her the night before. He called him Your Majesty, his voice thick with relief and barely restrained emotion, and the others quickly followed suit, kneeling in the snow despite the cold and exhaustion clearly written across their own faces from a long night of searching. Cale waved them up almost immediately, his tone carrying quiet authority even in his weakened state, telling them to rise and report. The guard who had spoken first, a broad-shouldered man introduced simply as Garrett, explained that they had lost track of Cale during the ambush the previous evening, that the enemy scouts had scattered before they could be caught, and that the entire search party had feared the worst once the storm rolled in and made any further search impossible until morning. Relief was plain across every one of their faces now that they had found their king alive, though their eyes kept flickering with obvious confusion toward Elena, standing quietly beside him in the mouth of the small cave. Kale did not immediately explain her presence, and Elena felt the weight of 4 pairs of curious, assessing eyes settle on her, taking in her ordinary human clothing, her exhausted face, the makeshift bandages she had clearly fashioned from her own torn scarf. Garrett's gaze lingered longest, moving between her and Kale, with an expression that suggested he was piecing together more of the story than Kale had yet spoken aloud, and something in his careful, measured silence told Elena that whatever conclusions he was drawing carried significance she did not yet understand. Kale finally spoke, his voice steady despite his obvious exhaustion, explaining briefly that this woman had found him in the storm, badly wounded from silver poisoning, and had treated his injuries and kept him alive through the night, without any knowledge of what he truly was. He did not elaborate further, but something in the careful way he chose his words, and the way his guard's expressions shifted from confusion to something more startled and intent as he spoke, told Elena there was significance in his account that went beyond simple gratitude for a rescue. Garrett stepped closer, studying her with new interest, his earlier wariness softening into something more like careful curiosity. He asked, with obvious hesitation, whether she had been harmed at all during the encounter, whether the silver fragments she had apparently removed from the king's wound had touched her skin directly. Elena confirmed that they had, that she had used her bare hands in places where her small knife could not reach precisely enough, and watched as Garrett's eyebrows rose sharply, an unreadable look passing between him and the other guards. She did not understand the significance of the question, but she noticed Kale watching her reaction closely, his expression thoughtful and unreadable, in a way that made her stomach tighten with unease. Before she could ask what any of it meant, Garrett turned back to Kale and reported, more formally now, that the healers back at the stronghold needed to examine the wound properly, that traveling even a short distance in his condition carried real risk, but that remaining exposed on the mountainside carried greater risk still, particularly with enemy scouts potentially still active in the area. Kale agreed, and the guards moved quickly into action, producing a length of sturdy fabric and wooden poles from packs they carried, fashioning a rough stretcher with practiced efficiency that told Elena this was not the first time they had needed to transport an injured person through difficult terrain. Kale protested weakly that he could walk on his own strength, an assertion immediately and firmly overruled by Garrett, who reminded him with surprising bluntness, for someone addressing a king, that stubborn pride had gotten better men killed, and that his life mattered too much to the stability of the entire territory to be risked over wounded dignity. As the guards prepared to move Kale onto the stretcher, his eyes found Elena's across the small space, and something passed between them, an unspoken question about what would happen to her now that his people had arrived. She realized, with a fresh wave of uncertainty, that she stood at some kind of crossroads. She could ask to be shown the safest path back down toward her own village, return to her ordinary life, as though the last night had been nothing more than a strange, half-remembered dream, or she could follow this king and his guards into whatever world lay hidden in these mountains, a world of poisoned weapons and royal titles, and dangers she barely understood. Kale seemed to sense her hesitation, and even in his weakened state, propped up now on the stretcher his guards had assembled, he spoke to her directly, his voice carrying an unmistakable weight of sincerity. He told her that he would not force her to come with them, that her home and her family were waiting for her, and she owed his world nothing more than what she had already given through the long, freezing night just past. But he added, more quietly, that his enemies now knew a human had witnessed his true nature, and had directly interfered with their plot against him, and that until the threat against him was fully resolved, he could not in good conscience guarantee her safety if she returned alone to an unprotected village. The words settled heavily over Elena, confirming the fear that had been building in her chest since he first explained what he truly was. She thought of her father and mother in their small farmhouse, unaware that their daughter's simple errand into the mountains had entangled her in a conflict involving kings and assassins, and secrets meant to remain hidden from human eyes. She thought about walking away, about pretending none of this had ever happened, and found she could not fully convince herself that doing so would actually keep her safe, not now that people already knew her face and her role in Kale's survival. Garrett spoke up then, his tone more gentle than before, offering a compromise that seemed to ease some of the tension in the small cave. He suggested that Elena travel with them to the stronghold, not as a prisoner or an obligation, but as a guest under the king's protection, at least until they could better understand the scope of the threat and ensure no lingering danger followed her back to her own home. He added, with a glance toward Cale that Elena could not quite interpret, that given everything she had already witnessed and done, leaving her unprotected and unexplained, seemed both unwise and, in his own words, deeply ungrateful. Elena weighed the offer carefully, torn between the pull of home and family and the undeniable reality that she was now tangled in something far larger than herself. In the end, it was not fear that decided her, but a stubborn, familiar instinct, the same one that had pulled her toward the sound of a suffering wolf in the middle of a blizzard. She wanted to understand what she had stumbled into. She wanted to know that Cale, whom she had fought through an entire freezing night to keep alive, would actually recover fully from his wounds. And beneath both of those reasons, quieter and harder to name, was a thread of curiosity about this hidden world, and the strange, undeniable pull she felt toward the wounded stranger, now watching her from the stretcher, waiting for her answer. She agreed to travel with them, at least for a short time, enough to understand what danger she might still be in, and to see for herself that Cale's recovery was secured. The guards nodded their understanding, already shifting their focus to the practical matter of the journey ahead, discussing quietly among themselves the safest route down through terrain still treacherous from the recent storm. Cale's gaze lingered on Elena a moment longer, something like quiet relief, and equally quiet worry mixing in his expression, though he said nothing further, conserving his strength for the journey that lay ahead. The trek down the mountainside proved slow and difficult, the guards moving with careful precision over snow that had drifted into unstable, uneven mounds overnight, testing each section of ground before committing Cale's weight to it on the makeshift stretcher. Elena walked alongside, refusing the offer of being carried herself despite her own exhaustion, insisting that her legs still worked fine, and that the guards had enough to manage, without adding her weight to their burden. Garrett walked near her for much of the descent, and in the quiet stretches of the journey, she found herself asking careful questions, testing the edges of what she was and was not permitted to know about the world she had stumbled into. He answered what he could, explaining in broad terms that Lycans had lived hidden alongside humans for centuries, maintaining careful secrecy to avoid the kind of persecution their kind had suffered in ages past, when fear and misunderstanding had led humans to hunt them nearly to extinction. He explained that Cale's territory encompassed a significant stretch of the mountain range and the forests beyond, governed from a hidden stronghold that Elena would see for herself before the day was through, and that the attack the night before had been the latest and most serious in a string of attempts by rival factions seeking to destabilize Cale's rule and claim the territory for themselves. Elena listened carefully, piecing together a picture of a world far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined existed alongside her own quiet, ordinary life in the village below. She thought of Cale's earlier words, about how rare her kind of reckless compassion was in his world, and wondered exactly what she had walked into, and exactly how much more she would come to understand about it, before this strange chapter of her life finally came to its end. By the time the afternoon light began to slant golden and low across the snow-covered peaks, the small party crested a final ridge, and Elena caught her first glimpse of the hidden stronghold nestled in a valley below, its walls built into the very stone of the mountain itself, ancient and imposing, and utterly unlike anything she had ever seen or imagined existed so close to her own quiet home. She stopped for a moment, breath catching in her throat, fully absorbing the reality that her life had changed irrevocably the moment she chose to follow a dying creature's cry into the heart of a blizzard, and that there was no path back now to the simple, ordinary existence she had known only 2 days before. The gates of the stronghold opened at their approach, worked by hands Elena could not see, revealing a courtyard carved from the same dark stone as the walls surrounding it, torches already lit against the fading afternoon light despite the hour. Word of the king's return had clearly traveled ahead of them, because a crowd had gathered near the entrance, dozens of faces turning as one toward the small procession, expressions shifting rapidly from anxious hope to open relief the moment they confirmed Cale was alive. A woman pushed through the gathered crowd before the guards had even fully lowered the stretcher, her face lined with worry that eased only slightly at the sight of him breathing and conscious. She introduced herself to Elena briefly as Mira, the stronghold's chief healer, before turning her full attention to Cale, her hands already moving to examine the bandages Elena had fashioned the night before, with brisk, practiced efficiency. Mira's eyebrows rose as she studied the wound, and she asked, without looking up, who had treated it, and removed the silver fragments so cleanly. When Garrett explained that Elena had done so, using nothing but a small knife and boiled snowmelt, Mira's gaze snapped up to study her properly for the first time, an expression of frank astonishment crossing her weathered features. She said, half to herself, that the work had been done as well as any trained healer could have managed, under far better conditions, and that whoever had taught Elena such careful field treatment deserved credit for saving the king's life, just as much as Elena herself did. Elena admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that she had learned everything from years of tending injured farm animals, never expecting the knowledge to apply to anything more significant than a sick lamb or an injured dog. Mira's expression softened into something like genuine warmth at that admission, and she told Elena plainly that instinct and steady hands mattered more in an emergency than any formal training, and that the king owed his life to both in equal measure. Kale was carried further into the stronghold for proper treatment, and Elena found herself standing somewhat awkwardly in the courtyard, uncertain of her place now that the immediate crisis had passed, surrounded by curious faces that regarded her with a mixture of gratitude and wary uncertainty. Garrett noticed her discomfort and offered to show her to quarters where she could rest and clean herself up after the ordeal of the past 2 days, an offer she accepted gratefully, suddenly aware of just how exhausted and disheveled she must look after everything she had endured. The room she was led to was simple but comfortable, carved into the same dark stone as the rest of the stronghold, but warmed by a fire already crackling in the hearth, and softened by woven rugs and heavy blankets, clearly meant for a guest of some importance. Elena sank onto the edge of the bed once Garrett left her alone, the full weight of exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed, and found herself staring at her own hands, the same hands that had pulled poisoned silver from the wound of a king only hours before, hardly able to believe the events of the past 2 days had actually happened. Sleep claimed her quickly despite her racing thoughts, and when she woke, sunlight was slanting through a narrow window carved high in the stone wall, telling her she had slept through the remainder of the previous evening and well into the following morning. A simple meal had been left near the door at some point while she slept, along with a change of clothes far finer than anything she had ever owned, and Elena found herself studying the fine fabric with a mixture of curiosity and unease, wondering what her place truly was in this strange hidden world she had fallen into. She had barely finished eating when a soft knock came at her door, and she opened it to find Garrett waiting, his expression more relaxed than she had seen it during the tense journey down the mountain. He informed her that Kale was recovering well, that the wound was healing faster than expected now that the silver had been properly removed, and that the king had specifically requested her presence once she was rested and ready. Elena followed Garrett through corridors carved deep into the mountain, past chambers and hallways that spoke of a civilization far older and more established than she had ever imagined existing, hidden so close to her own quiet village, until they reached a large chamber where Kale sat propped against cushions, looking considerably stronger than he had the day before, though a fresh bandage still wrapped his shoulder beneath his shirt. His amber eyes found hers the moment she entered, and something in his expression eased visibly at the sight of her, a reaction that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, despite her lingering uncertainty about everything happening around her. He thanked her formally, in front of several attendants who had gathered near the chamber entrance, his words carrying the weight of genuine gratitude rather than mere courtesy, acknowledging before all of them that she had saved his life, through no obligation of her own, at real risk to herself, and that such a debt would not go unrepaid. Elena felt a flush of embarrassment at the formal attention, unused to such open acknowledgement for what had simply felt, in the moment, like the only decent thing she could have done. Once the attendants had withdrawn at Kale's quiet dismissal, leaving only Garrett stationed near the entrance, Kale's expression shifted into something more private and searching. He asked her plainly how she was feeling, whether the stronghold's healers had examined her properly for any lingering effects from her contact with the silver, and whether she had slept well despite the strangeness of her surroundings. His concern seemed genuine, extending well beyond the formal gratitude he had offered moments before, and Elena found herself oddly touched by the careful attention. She admitted that she felt well, better than she had any right to after everything they had both endured, and asked in turn how his recovery was progressing. He told her, with something like wry amusement, that Mira had confined him to this chamber for at least another day, despite his own preference to be up and addressing the matter of who had orchestrated the attack against him, and that her stubbornness on the matter rivaled even his own. The conversation drifted, easier now than the tense, careful exchanges of the mountain cave, and Elena found herself relaxing slightly in his presence, despite everything that remained unresolved about her situation. She asked him what would happen now, whether the enemies responsible for the attack had been identified, and whether her own presence here created additional danger for the stronghold and its people. Cale's expression grew more serious at the question, and he admitted that the investigation into the attack was ongoing, that the silver used against him suggested careful planning and resources beyond a simple rogue attack, and that until the responsible party was identified, caution remained necessary for everyone involved, including her. He hesitated then, something clearly weighing on him beyond the immediate practical concerns of the investigation, and Elena watched him carefully, sensing there was more he intended to say, but had not yet found the words for. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a new gravity that made her stomach tighten with anticipation, though she could not have guessed what was actually coming. He told her there was something about her he needed to explain, something Garrett and Mira had both noticed during her treatment of his wound, something that went beyond simple gratitude for her role in his survival, and that understanding it properly would change how she viewed everything that had happened between them in that small mountain cave. Elena felt her pulse quicken at the seriousness in Cale's tone, uncertain whether to brace for good news or bad, though something in his careful hesitation suggested even he was not entirely sure how to explain what he meant to say. He asked her, somewhat abruptly, whether she had noticed a faint mark on the inside of her left wrist, something she might have dismissed over the years as an unusual birthmark, or a trick of the skin's shading. The question caught her completely off guard. She did have such a mark, a pale, faint pattern near her wrist that had been there for as long as she could remember, one her mother had always called a lucky mark, and never thought twice about beyond that. She had never questioned it, had barely thought about it in years, and could not imagine why it mattered now, in this chamber, to a wounded king recovering from a poisoning attempt. Cale's expression grew more intent as she confirmed the mark's existence, and he explained, choosing his words with obvious care, that among his people, certain individuals carried a dormant sign upon their skin from birth, one that remained faint and unremarkable for an entire lifetime, unless a very particular kind of bond was formed with another person. He told her that such marks, when they finally awakened, revealed something his kind called a fated bond, a connection formed not by choice or courtship, but by something deeper and older than either, recognized instantly by anyone of his kind who witnessed it. Elena listened with growing confusion, uncertain where this explanation was leading, though a small, uneasy suspicion had already begun forming in the back of her mind. She asked, carefully, what exactly triggered such a mark to awaken, and Cale held her gaze steadily as he answered, his voice quieter now than before. He told her that legend held such bonds awakened in moments of profound and selfless sacrifice, when one person risked everything, without hesitation or expectation of reward, purely out of compassion for another. The room seemed to grow very still, as the implication of his words settled fully over her. Elena thought back to the moment she had first seen the wounded wolf in the snow, to the instant decision that had sent her toward danger rather than away from it, to the hours she had spent through that freezing night, doing everything within her power to keep a stranger, a creature she had never met before, alive against every reasonable instinct for her own safety. She understood, with a jolt that left her slightly breathless, exactly what Cale was telling her, even before he said the words plainly. He told her that Garrett had noticed the faint glow along her wrist when he examined her hands for silver burns the day before, a glow too subtle for her to have seen herself, and that Mira had confirmed what Garrett suspected while treating Cale's own wound. The mark upon Elena's wrist had begun to awaken, faint but unmistakable, in the exact pattern that legend described as the sign of a king's fated Luna, the one bond among his kind considered too significant and too rare to occur more than once in many generations. Elena sat with the revelation in stunned silence, her mind racing to process something that felt entirely too large and strange to fit within the boundaries of her ordinary understanding of the world. She asked, somewhat weakly, what exactly this meant in practical terms, uncertain whether Cale was describing some kind of formal obligation, some ancient custom she had unknowingly bound herself into through nothing more than an instinct to help a dying creature in the snow. Kale's expression grew gentler at the obvious confusion and unease written across her face, and he assured her, with careful sincerity, that a fated bond carried no obligation she had not already chosen for herself through her own actions. He explained that among his people, the mark represented a possibility rather than a demand, a recognition that two individuals shared a connection, deep enough to be acknowledged by fate itself, but that what either of them chose to do with that recognition remained entirely their own decision. Even as he spoke the reassuring words, Elena could see something else moving beneath the surface of his careful composure, a complexity to his own feelings about the revelation that he had not yet put fully into words. She asked him directly what the mark meant for him, personally, beyond the formal explanation of tradition and legend he had just offered. Kale was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes searching her face as though weighing exactly how much honesty the moment could bear. When he finally answered, his voice had dropped lower, carrying a weight of sincerity that made her breath catch in her throat. He told her that he had never expected, in all his years ruling this territory, to encounter the sign of a fated bond at all, that many Lycans lived and died without ever finding such a connection, and that discovering it now, awakened by her selfless actions on a freezing mountainside, felt like something he was still struggling fully to comprehend himself. He admitted, with unusual candor for a man who clearly carried the weight of leadership and formality in most of his interactions, that some part of him had already begun to feel drawn toward her, in a way that went beyond simple gratitude for his rescue, even before Garrett had noticed the mark upon her wrist. Elena did not know how to respond to such an admission, her own emotions tangled between the shock of everything she had learned in the past 2 days, a cautious wariness about being drawn into obligations she barely understood, and an unexpected warmth that stirred low in her chest at the sincerity in his voice as he spoke. She reminded him, gently but firmly, that she barely knew him, that whatever legend or fate had marked her wrist did not erase the fact that they were, in every practical sense, still strangers to one another, and that she needed time to understand what any of this actually meant before she could consider what, if anything, she wanted to do about it. Kale accepted her hesitation without any visible frustration or pressure, telling her plainly that he had no intention of forcing understanding or acceptance onto something that deserved to unfold naturally, on her own terms, and in her own time. He told her she was welcome to remain at the stronghold for as long as she needed, under his protection, and without any expectation attached to that protection, beyond her own safety and comfort, and that whatever came next between them, if anything came at all, would be built on choice rather than obligation. His words eased some of the tightness in Elena's chest, though the strangeness of her situation remained overwhelming. A quiet mountain village girl, who had somehow, through nothing more than an inability to walk past a suffering creature, found herself marked as the fated match of a hidden kingdom's ruling king. She thanked him for his understanding, and as she made her way back toward her own quarters afterward, her mind turned over everything she had learned, the mark upon her wrist suddenly feeling far heavier upon her skin than it ever had before, though she still could not quite believe, in the practical light of day, that it carried the significance he claimed it did. That evening, alone in her chamber, Elena finally examined her wrist closely by candlelight, and found, for the first time in her life, that the faint pattern she had always dismissed as an ordinary birthmark now carried the barest hint of a warm, golden glow beneath her skin, faint enough that she might have missed it entirely had she not known exactly where to look. She stared at it for a long time, her thoughts a tangled mixture of disbelief, wonder, and a cautious, uncertain hope she was not yet ready to name, and wondered exactly how much further her strange new path was about to lead her before this chapter of her life finally found its resolution. Days passed inside the stronghold, and Elena found herself settling, cautiously, into a strange new rhythm. Mira checked on her often, partly out of medical concern, and partly, Elena suspected, out of simple curiosity about the human woman whose actions had awakened such a rare bond. Garrett remained a steady, reassuring presence, walking with her through the stronghold's corridors and courtyards, answering her endless questions about Lycan customs and history, with more patience than she had expected from a warrior clearly more accustomed to combat than conversation. She learned that the stronghold housed several hundred residents, families who had lived within its protection for generations, farmers and craftspeople and warriors all bound together under Kale's rule. She learned that Lycans aged more slowly than humans, healed from injuries that would kill an ordinary person, and possessed strength and senses far beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. And she learned, gradually, piecing together fragments from careful conversations, that the attack against Kale had not been a random act of violence, but the latest move in a long and complicated struggle for power within the wider Lycan territories. Despite her growing understanding, Elena found herself wrestling constantly with doubt about her own place in all of it. She had not asked for a fated mark, had not asked to be pulled into royal politics and ancient legends, and some part of her longed simply to return to her quiet, uncomplicated life in the village below, tending sheep and helping her father with the farm, free from the weight of expectations she barely understood. She thought often of her parents, imagining their worry over her prolonged absence, and raised the matter with Kale during one of their evening conversations, asking whether some message could be sent to reassure them she was safe. Kale agreed immediately, arranging for a trusted messenger to travel to her village with a carefully worded explanation that she had been delayed by the storm and was recovering at a nearby settlement, an explanation that stretched the truth considerably, but avoided revealing anything of the world she had stumbled into. Elena felt a measure of relief at the arrangement, though the deception, however necessary, added another layer of unease to her already tangled feelings about her situation. It was during one such evening conversation, seated near the fire in Kale's private study, while he reviewed reports from his advisors, that Elena finally voiced the doubts that had been building steadily within her. She told him plainly that she did not know how to reconcile the ordinary girl she had always understood herself to be, with the strange new role everyone around her seemed to expect her to step into, that the idea of being anyone's fated match, let alone the match of a king ruling over an entire hidden territory, felt impossibly large and unfamiliar, a costume that did not fit no matter how she tried to wear it. Kale listened without interrupting, setting aside the reports he had been reviewing to give her his full attention, and when she finished, he did not attempt to dismiss her doubts or convince her they were unfounded. Instead, he told her that he understood the weight of what she was describing better than she might expect, that he too had spent considerable time since her mark awakened, wrestling with what it truly meant for both of them, and that he had no intention of pretending the path ahead would be simple or without difficulty. He reminded her, gently, that nothing about the bond required her to become anything other than exactly who she already was, that whatever role she eventually chose to embrace, if she chose to embrace one at all, would be built around her own nature rather than demanding she abandon it. His words offered some comfort, though the uncertainty in Elena's chest remained, tangled further by the undeniable warmth she felt whenever she was near him, a pull she could not fully explain through logic or reason, but felt as clearly and steadily as her own heartbeat. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the study door, and Garrett entered without waiting for a response, his expression tight with an urgency that immediately put both Elena and Kale on alert. He informed Kale that the Council of Elders had convened an emergency session, having learned of Elena's presence within the stronghold and the awakened mark upon her wrist, and that several members were demanding Kale's immediate presence to address what they were already calling an unprecedented and dangerous complication to established Lycan tradition. Kale's jaw tightened at the news, and Elena saw a flash of genuine frustration cross his features before he carefully smoothed it away, rising to his feet with the measured composure of a leader accustomed to managing difficult situations. He told Garrett he would attend the session immediately, and turned to Elena with an apologetic expression, explaining that the council held significant influence within Lycan governance, a body of elders drawn from the oldest and most respected families within the territory, whose approval or disapproval carried real weight even against a king's own authority. Elena asked, with rising unease, what exactly the council might do in response to learning about her, and Kale's expression grew more guarded as he answered, choosing his words carefully. He told her that tradition among his people held certain expectations about the nature of a king's chosen Luna, expectations that had never, in living memory, needed to account for the possibility of a human woman carrying the mark, and that some among the council's older, more conservative members were likely to view her presence as a direct challenge to customs they held sacred. He assured her that he would not allow the council to dictate decisions that belonged rightfully to him and to her alone, but the tension in his voice as he spoke told Elena that the coming confrontation carried real stakes stakes that extended well beyond simple disapproval or awkward tradition. She watched him leave the study with Garrett, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach, and found herself pacing the length of the small room afterward, unable to settle, painfully aware of just how quickly the fragile, uncertain peace she had begun to build within the stronghold's walls could unravel beneath the weight of politics and tradition she barely understood. Mira found her there some time later, drawn by news of the emergency council session, and settled into a chair near the fire, with the weary expression of someone who had witnessed many such political storms over a long lifetime. She told Elena, with blunt honesty that Elena had come to appreciate in the older woman, that the council's reaction was not entirely unreasonable, given the unprecedented nature of the situation, but that reasonable caution and outright hostility were two very different things, and that certain members of the council, most notably an ambitious elder named Draven, had never fully accepted Kale's rule, and would likely seize any opportunity, however unlikely, to use Elena's presence as a wedge to further their own agenda. Elena absorbed this information with a growing sense of dread, understanding now that her presence within the stronghold had created ripples far beyond her own personal uncertainty about the fated bond, ripples that threatened the stability of Kale's entire rule and potentially placed both of them squarely in the path of political maneuvering she had no experience navigating. She thought again of her quiet life in the village below, of sheep and farm work, and the simple, predictable rhythm of days she had once taken entirely for granted, and wondered, not for the first time since finding the wounded wolf in the snow, exactly how far this strange new path was going to carry her before she found solid ground again. The council chamber lay deep within the oldest section of the stronghold, a circular room carved from raw stone centuries before, lit by torches that cast long, flickering shadows across the assembled elders seated around a great curved table. Kale entered with measured steps, his expression composed despite the tension visibly radiating through the room, and took his place at the head of the gathering with the quiet authority of a man who had faced hostile audiences before and did not intend to be rattled by this one. 9 elders sat around the table, representatives of the oldest bloodlines within the territory, each carrying decades or centuries of accumulated influence and tradition. Most watched Kale with expressions ranging from cautious concern to outright wariness, but it was the elder seated closest to Kale's right, a tall, sharp-featured man named Draven, whose expression carried something closer to barely restrained satisfaction, as though the situation unfolding played directly into calculations he had been quietly making for a very long time. Draven spoke first, his voice smooth and measured in a way that immediately put Kale on guard, expressing what he framed as genuine concern for the stability and traditions of their people, rather than any personal grievance against his king. He acknowledged that Kale's survival following the recent attack was cause for relief throughout the territory, but pressed immediately toward the matter that had drawn the council together, the presence of a human woman within the stronghold, marked, according to reports, as the king's fated Luna. He reminded the assembled elders, though his words were clearly directed as much toward Kale as toward his fellow council members, that in the entire recorded history of their people, no king had ever taken a human as Luna, that the very nature of the bond had always been understood to occur exclusively between Lycans, and that whatever mark had appeared upon this woman's skin, its true meaning and legitimacy deserved far more careful scrutiny before any formal recognition was extended. Kale's expression remained carefully controlled as he responded, though Elena, watching from a small alcove near the chamber entrance where Garrett had brought her at Kale's request, could see the tension coiled beneath his composed exterior. He told the council plainly that the mark had been confirmed independently by both Garrett and Mira, 2 individuals whose judgment and loyalty no one in the room had cause to question, and that the legitimacy of a fated bond was not a matter subject to debate or preference, but a fact of nature that revealed itself according to its own ancient logic, regardless of whether it matched prior precedent. An older elder, near the far end of the table, a woman with silver hair and a deeply lined face, named Corwin, spoke next, her tone more measured and thoughtful than Draven's had been. She acknowledged that fated bonds were, by their nature, beyond the council's authority to grant or deny, but raised a different concern entirely, one focused on the practical dangers of a human woman's continued presence within the stronghold. She asked directly whether Kale had considered the risk his enemies now posed toward Elena, given that her role in his survival and her connection to him were no longer secrets, and whether the territory's security could realistically be maintained while accommodating a human, unfamiliar with even the most basic protections their world required. Cale acknowledged the validity of Corwin's concern, with more grace than he had shown toward Draven's earlier challenge, admitting that Elena's safety weighed heavily on his own mind, and that measures were already being taken to ensure her protection within the stronghold's walls. But he added, firmly, that abandoning her, or sending her back to an unprotected life in her village, would create far greater danger than allowing her to remain under his direct protection, and that he had no intention of turning his back on someone who had risked her own life to save his, without any expectation of reward. Draven seized on the exchange, his voice sharpening slightly despite his continued outward composure, suggesting that perhaps the wisest course of action would involve relocating the human woman to some distant, unremarkable location, under discreet protection, severing any visible connection to Cale or the stronghold entirely, thereby eliminating the political complication and the security risk in a single, efficient stroke. His proposal drew murmurs of consideration from several other elders around the table, and Elena felt her stomach tighten painfully as she listened from the alcove, understanding fully now the precariousness of her position within this hidden world. Cale's response came swift and unequivocal, his voice carrying an edge of steel that silenced the murmuring around the table almost instantly. He told the council in plain terms that he would not abandon his fated Luna to appease concerns rooted more in rigid tradition than genuine wisdom, that the bond itself represented a rare and significant sign that deserved respect rather than dismissal, and that any further discussion of relocating Elena against her will, or his own, would be considered by him a direct challenge to his authority as ruling king. The chamber fell into tense silence following his declaration, several elders exchanging uneasy glances, clearly weighing the wisdom of pressing the matter further against a king who had made his position unmistakably clear. Draven, however, did not appear fully deterred, his expression settling into something colder and more calculating than open confrontation, a shift Elena noticed even from her distant vantage point, and found more unsettling than his earlier, more direct challenge had been. Elder Corwin spoke again, attempting to steer the conversation toward more practical ground, suggesting that regardless of the council's opinions on tradition, the immediate priority should remain identifying and neutralizing the threat responsible for the attack against Cale, an investigation that had thus far yielded frustratingly little concrete information, despite several days of effort. She noted that the sophistication of the silver weapon used against Cale suggested resources and knowledge beyond what a simple rogue faction would typically possess, hinting at organized support from somewhere within, or connected to, established Lycan circles. The observation drew the council's attention away from the matter of Elena, at least temporarily, as discussion shifted toward the ongoing investigation and the unsettling implications of Corwin's assessment. Cale participated in the strategic discussion that followed with careful attention, though Elena noticed his gaze flicker occasionally toward the alcove where she waited, as though reassuring himself of her continued presence and safety, even while his focus remained divided among the council's competing concerns. The session continued for the better part of 2 hours, moving through matters of security, resource allocation, and diplomatic outreach to neighboring territories, whose cooperation might prove valuable in identifying the source of the attack. By the time the council finally adjourned, Elena's legs ached from standing so long in the alcove, and her mind felt heavy with the accumulated weight of everything she had overheard, the political complexity, the barely veiled hostility from certain quarters, and the unmistakable danger that continued to surround both herself and Cale, despite the relative safety of the stronghold's walls. As the elders filed out of the chamber, Draven paused near the alcove entrance, his sharp eyes settling on Elena, with an expression that carried none of the open hostility he had displayed toward Cale, but something far more unsettling in its calculated neutrality. He offered her a shallow, formal bow, his voice carrying a smooth, almost pleasant tone that did nothing to ease the unease crawling up her spine. He told her, with what sounded almost like genuine sympathy, that he hoped she understood the council's concerns came not from any personal ill will toward her, but from a duty to protect traditions that had preserved their people through centuries of hidden survival, and that he trusted she would consider carefully whether remaining within a world so fundamentally foreign to her own truly served her best interests in the long run. The words carried a subtle threat beneath their polite surface, one Elena felt clearly despite Draven's careful phrasing, and she watched him walk away afterward with a growing certainty that whatever opposition he had voiced openly in the council chamber represented only a fraction of what he actually intended to pursue. Cale joined her moments later, his expression grim as he took in her troubled face, and without needing to ask, seemed to understand exactly what had passed between her and the departing elder. He apologized for the difficulty of the session, for the hostility she had been forced to witness, and assured her again that he would not allow the council's opposition, or Draven's particular brand of calculated maneuvering, to threaten either her safety or her place within the stronghold. But as they walked together back toward the more comfortable quarters of the fortress, Elena could see the weight of the confrontation still sitting heavily upon him, an awareness, she suspected, that Draven's quiet parting words represented not a retreat, but merely the opening move in a far more dangerous game still to come. Nearly a week passed following the tense council session, and Elena gradually settled into a fragile sense of routine within the stronghold, though the memory of Draven's calculated words never fully left her thoughts. She spent her mornings with Mira, learning what she could about Lycan healing methods and finding, to her own surprise, that she had a genuine aptitude for the work, her years of farm experience translating naturally into the careful, hands-on treatment that Mira's craft demanded. Her afternoons often found her with Cale, walking the stronghold's upper terraces where the mountain air was crisp and clear, their conversations growing easier and more natural with each passing day, the careful distance between them slowly narrowing into something warmer and harder to name. It was during one such quiet afternoon, the two of them seated on a stone bench overlooking the valley below, that the peace of the stronghold shattered without warning. A horn sounded from the outer walls, sharp and urgent, followed almost immediately by shouts of alarm, echoing up from the courtyard. Cale was on his feet instantly, every trace of the relaxed ease he had shown moments before, replaced by sharp, focused alertness, his hand moving instinctively to the sword he carried, even during quiet moments within his own walls. Garrett appeared at the terrace entrance within seconds, breathing hard from a dead run, his expression grim as he reported that armed intruders had breached the outer perimeter, moving with speed and coordination that suggested careful planning rather than a desperate, opportunistic assault. He added, his eyes flicking briefly to Elena with unmistakable concern, that early reports suggested the attackers were moving with clear purpose toward the stronghold's inner chambers, rather than attempting the kind of broad, destructive assault typical of a force seeking simple conquest. Cale's expression darkened at the implication, and Elena understood immediately what he and Garrett both already suspected, that this attack had been planned with specific knowledge of the stronghold's layout, and specific intent behind its target. She felt a cold spike of fear settle in her chest, not entirely for her own safety, but for the growing certainty that she herself might be the very purpose behind this sudden, violent incursion. Cale turned to her immediately, his voice sharp with urgency, but carrying an underlying steadiness, meant to anchor her against the rising panic she could feel building in her own chest. He told her to stay close to Garrett, to follow every instruction without hesitation, and that he would not allow harm to reach her while breath remained in his body. Before she could respond, he was already moving, calling orders to the guards gathering rapidly in the courtyard below, his composed authority steadying the visible fear rippling through the assembled defenders. Garrett guided Elena quickly through a series of narrow stone corridors, away from the direct path of the fighting, audible now echoing from somewhere below, his pace urgent but controlled, clearly following some established protocol for exactly this kind of emergency. She could hear the clash of weapons growing louder at certain points along their route, punctuated by shouts and the occasional pained cry, sounds that made her stomach twist with dread, for everyone caught in the violence unfolding through the stronghold's usually peaceful halls. They had nearly reached what Garrett explained was a secure inner chamber, built centuries ago specifically to shelter vulnerable occupants during exactly this kind of crisis, when three figures emerged suddenly from a side passage ahead of them, cutting off their path with obvious deliberate intent. Garrett's sword was already in hand, before Elena fully registered the threat, positioning himself between her and the approaching attackers with the fluid, practiced ease of someone who had trained for combat his entire life. The fight that followed happened faster than Elena could fully process, Garrett moving with a speed and precision that seemed almost impossible to track, deflecting and countering the attacker's strikes, even as he worked to keep himself positioned protectively between them and Elena. One of the attackers broke free of the immediate clash, lunging directly toward Elena with clear, singular purpose, and she felt a scream lodge in her throat as she scrambled backward, her shoulder striking hard against the stone wall behind her. Garrett's blade found the attacker before he could close the remaining distance, a swift, decisive strike that ended the immediate threat, but the sound of additional footsteps echoing from further down the corridor told them both that reinforcements were converging on their position. Garrett's expression tightened with the calculation of a man weighing difficult odds, and he told Elena urgently that they needed to move, that remaining in the open corridor invited more danger than pressing forward toward the secure chamber ahead. They ran the remaining distance, Elena's heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and Garrett barely managed to seal the heavy chamber door behind them before more pursuing footsteps arrived just beyond it, the sound of fists and weapons striking uselessly against reinforced stone and iron. Elena sank against the far wall of the small chamber, her legs finally giving out beneath the weight of adrenaline and fear, while Garrett stood guard near the sealed entrance, his breathing hard but his focus unwavering. Time passed strangely in the enclosed chamber, each minute stretching unbearably, as Elena strained to interpret the muffled sounds of continued fighting somewhere beyond the thick stone walls, unable to know whether Cale remained safe, unable to know how the larger battle was unfolding throughout the rest of the stronghold. She thought of Draven's calculated words from the council chamber, of the timing of this attack coming so soon after her presence had been formally acknowledged and debated, and felt a growing, uneasy certainty that this assault was connected far more directly to her own presence than to any broader political ambition against Cale's rule alone. Eventually, the sounds beyond the chamber door began to fade, the clash of combat giving way to a tense, uncertain quiet that felt almost more unsettling than the noise it replaced. Garrett remained alert, sword still ready in hand, until finally a specific pattern of knocks sounded against the sealed door. A signal, he explained quickly to Elena, that confirmed the arrival of trusted guards rather than continued threat. The door opened to reveal several of the stronghold's soldiers, weary and bearing visible wounds from the fighting, but carrying the unmistakable relief of victory rather than defeat. They reported that the intruders had been repelled, their numbers too small to overcome the stronghold's full defense once the alarm had properly rallied the garrison, though several defenders had been wounded in the confrontation, and the attackers themselves had either been captured or had fled back into the mountain wilderness before they could be fully apprehended. Elena's relief at the news of victory was immediately tempered by an urgent need to know whether Cale himself had come through the assault unharmed, and she pushed past Garrett's cautious attempt to have her wait in the secure chamber a moment longer, hurrying instead toward the courtyard, where the aftermath of the battle was still being assessed. She found Cale standing near the center of the courtyard, a fresh cut visible along his forearm but otherwise steady on his feet, directing the efforts to tend the wounded and secure the perimeter against any possibility of a second wave. His eyes found hers the moment she entered the courtyard, and something in his composed, commanding expression cracked visibly at the sight of her, safe and unharmed. He crossed the distance between them quickly, his hands finding her shoulders as though needing to confirm through touch that she truly remained whole and uninjured, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of how close the danger had come settling heavily between them, without need for words. When Cale finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness Elena had not heard from him before, an admission that the fear of losing her during the attack had cut through him more sharply than any wound he had sustained in the actual fighting. He told her, quietly, that whatever careful distance either of them had been maintaining around the reality of their bond no longer felt sustainable, not after watching his own people fight and bleed to protect her, not after spending those long, uncertain minutes wondering whether she remained safe behind the sealed chamber door, while chaos raged through his own halls. Elena, still trembling from the adrenaline and fear of the attack, found she could not disagree with him. Whatever uncertainty she had carried about her place within this strange, dangerous new world felt suddenly less important than the simple, undeniable truth that she cared deeply for his safety, just as he clearly cared for hers, a truth that had been growing steadily beneath her careful hesitation since the very first night she had chosen to drag a dying wolf out of a blizzard, rather than walk on and save herself alone. In the aftermath of the attack, the stronghold moved quickly to secure answers about who had orchestrated the assault, and how they had managed to breach defenses that had held firm against lesser threats for generations. Garrett led the interrogation of the two attackers who had been captured alive, working alongside several other senior guards through the night, while Mira and her healers tended the wounded, scattered throughout the infirmary. Elena, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, spent much of the night helping Mira however she could, grateful for the distraction of practical work against the churning uncertainty still tightening her chest. By morning, Garrett brought grim news to Cale's private study, where Elena had joined him despite the early hour, neither of them having managed more than a few restless hours of sleep. The captured attackers, under careful and lawful questioning, had confirmed what both Cale and Elena had already begun to suspect. The assault had been funded and coordinated through channels connected to Draven's own household, though the attackers themselves, low-ranking mercenaries hired through intermediaries, could not directly confirm Draven's personal involvement beyond the financial trail leading unmistakably back toward his resources. Cale's expression turned to cold, controlled fury at the confirmation, his hands gripping the edge of his desk with enough force that Elena could see the tension straining through his knuckles. He told Garrett to gather whatever additional evidence could be assembled, discreetly and thoroughly, before bringing the matter before the full council, understanding clearly that an accusation against a sitting elder required irrefutable proof to avoid further destabilizing an already fractured political situation. Over the following days, the investigation deepened, uncovering a pattern of financial transactions and secret communications that painted an increasingly damning picture of Draven's ambitions. It became clear that his opposition to Elena's presence within the stronghold had never truly been rooted in concern for tradition, but rather in calculated fear that a strengthened, publicly beloved king, secured by a rare and legendary fated bond, would leave no opening for the kind of gradual political erosion Draven had apparently been orchestrating for years in pursuit of eventually claiming greater power for himself. Elena found herself drawn increasingly into these discussions, her insight into the timing and nature of the attacks proving valuable despite her outsider status, and she noticed a subtle but real shift in how the stronghold's residents regarded her during this tense period. Where once she had drawn curious, uncertain glances as an unprecedented human presence within their walls, she now found herself met more often with genuine warmth and gratitude, word having spread of her steady composure and practical help throughout the chaos of the attack and its long aftermath. It was Mira who first suggested, gently, during one of their quiet evening conversations in the infirmary, that Elena's growing acceptance among the stronghold's people offered Cale a path forward that could address the council's concerns more decisively than continued careful diplomacy ever could. She explained that Lycan tradition, for all its rigid formality, held one mechanism capable of overriding even the most stubborn political opposition, a public claiming ceremony, in which a king formally and irrevocably acknowledged his fated Luna before the full assembled council and people of his territory, a declaration that carried the weight of ancient law and could not be challenged or undone once spoken. Elena turned the idea over carefully in her mind before raising it with Cale, uncertain whether such a decisive, public step felt right for either of them, given how recently their bond had been revealed, and given the ongoing danger still swirling around Draven's unresolved treachery. When she finally broached the subject with Cale during a quiet moment on the terrace, his expression grew thoughtful and serious, weighing the suggestion with the same careful consideration he brought to every significant decision affecting his people. He told her honestly that he had already begun considering the same path himself, not merely as a political maneuver to counter Draven's influence, but because his own feelings toward her had grown, over these past weeks of shared danger and quiet companionship, into something he no longer wished to hold at careful, uncertain distance. He asked her, with a sincerity that made her breath catch, whether she felt ready to consider such a step herself, reminding her gently that the choice remained entirely hers, and that he would respect whatever answer she gave, even if that answer meant more time, or even a different path altogether. Elena thought of everything that had brought her to this moment, the wounded wolf in the snow, the long freezing night in the mountain cave, the strange awakening of a mark she had carried unknowingly her entire life, the weeks of uncertainty and danger and growing warmth that had followed. She thought of the courage it had taken to choose compassion over safety in that first desperate moment, and understood, with a clarity that settled deep and steady within her, that the same instinct guiding her now was not fear, but a genuine, hard-won certainty about the man standing before her, and the strange, unexpected life that had unfolded from that single choice to help a dying creature in the storm. She told him yes, that she was ready, and watched relief and joy break across his composed features in a way she had rarely seen from him, the careful control he maintained in every other aspect of his rule, softening entirely in this one private, personal moment between them. The ceremony was arranged swiftly, word spreading throughout the stronghold and beyond, into the wider territory, drawing not only the full council of elders, but representatives from allied territories, eager to witness an event so rare, it occurred perhaps once in several generations. Draven, still unaware that the evidence against him had been fully assembled, attended among the other elders, his expression carefully composed, though Elena noticed a flicker of unease crossing his features as he took in the scale and formality of the gathering. The ceremony began with traditional words spoken by Elder Corwin, who had been selected to preside given her seniority and her measured, respected standing among the council. Elena stood before the assembled crowd in the great hall, dressed in fine clothing provided by Mira and several other women of the stronghold who had taken it upon themselves to prepare her properly for the occasion, her heart pounding, but her resolve steady, as Cale took his place beside her, his amber eyes holding hers with unwavering warmth, despite the weight of formality surrounding them both. Cale spoke first, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall as he recounted, for the full assembly, the story of how Elena had found him dying in the snow, how she had risked her own life without hesitation or expectation of reward, and how the fated mark upon her wrist had awakened not through any ancient ritual or deliberate seeking, but through the simple, profound truth of her selfless compassion. He declared, formally and irrevocably, before the council and his people, that he claimed her as his Luna, bound not merely by ancient legend, but by his own genuine, deliberate choice. A murmur of emotion swept through the assembled crowd, many faces showing open approval and warmth at the declaration, the story of Elena's courage having spread widely enough throughout the stronghold that her claiming felt, to most present, less like an unprecedented disruption of tradition, and more like the natural culmination of events that had already won their hearts. Draven's expression, however, had grown visibly tense, his earlier careful composure cracking at the edges as he recognized the ceremony's power to cement Cale's position beyond any further challenge he might have hoped to mount. Before Draven could raise any objection, Garrett stepped forward from among the gathered guards, carrying a sealed collection of documents that represented the culmination of the investigation into the earlier attack. He requested formal permission from Elder Corwin to address the council with evidence of treachery against the crown, and as the documents were laid out before the assembled elders, detailing the financial trail and secret communications linking the attack directly to Draven's own household, the color drained visibly from Draven's face, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering entirely under the weight of undeniable proof. The chamber erupted into stunned murmurs as the council members examined the evidence. Several elders, who had previously sided cautiously with Draven's opposition, now regarding him with open shock and betrayal. Draven attempted weakly to protest his innocence, but the evidence proved too thorough and too damning to withstand serious challenge, and within the hour, under the authority of the assembled council itself, he was stripped of his seat and taken into custody to await formal judgment for his crimes against the crown and the safety of the territory's people. The dramatic unraveling of Draven's treachery, occurring in the very same ceremony that formalized Elena's place as Luna, left the assembled crowd with little doubt about where true loyalty and legitimacy resided. What had begun as a tense, uncertain gathering transformed, by its conclusion, into genuine celebration, the people of the stronghold and its allied territories, embracing both the resolution of a long-simmering threat and the joyful confirmation of a bond so rare that many present would likely never witness its like again in their lifetimes. Elena, standing beside Cale as the celebration unfolded around them, felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment finally settle into something like peace. The mark upon her wrist glowed warm and steady now, fully awakened, a visible symbol of the choice she had made in that freezing mountain cave, and every choice that had followed it since. Cale's hand found hers amid the celebration, his fingers lacing through her own with a quiet, certain warmth, and as the great hall filled with music and laughter, and the genuine goodwill of a people finally freed from the shadow of hidden treachery. Elena understood that whatever uncertain path still lay ahead, she would not be walking it alone. In the weeks that followed, the stronghold settled into a calm it had not known in a very long time. The shadow of Draven's treachery finally lifted, the political tension that had simmered beneath the surface of Kael's rule for years, quietly resolving itself, as loyal elders stepped forward to fill the gap left by his removal. Corwin, respected and steady, took on a larger role in guiding the council through the transition, and under her measured influence, the remaining members grew increasingly supportive of the king's rule, and the unprecedented but undeniably legitimate bond he had formed with his human Luna. Elena's own place within the stronghold continued to grow and deepen with each passing week. She spent her mornings still with Mira, her skill with healing growing steadily, as she absorbed more of the older woman's knowledge, finding genuine purpose and satisfaction in work that echoed, in many ways, the simple farm instincts that had first led her to help a dying creature in the snow, all those months ago. Word of her healing work spread beyond the stronghold's walls, and increasingly, villagers from the surrounding human settlements, unaware of the true nature of the community they were seeking help from, came to her for treatment of ailments and injuries that the isolated mountain communities had few other resources to address. She traveled back to her own village not long after the ceremony, accompanied by Kael and a small escort, to properly explain to her parents everything that had unfolded since the night of the blizzard. The conversation proved difficult, her parents' shock and worry evident, as she carefully explained the truth of what Kael was, the danger that had surrounded her, and the bond that had formed between them. But her mother, watching the way Kael looked at her daughter throughout the long, careful explanation, the quiet devotion evident in every gesture and word, found her worry gradually softening into something like cautious acceptance, telling Elena privately afterward that she had never seen anyone look at her daughter with such complete and steady devotion, not even in her wildest hopes for Elena's future happiness. Her father took longer to come around fully, understandably wary of a world he had spent his entire life unaware existed, hidden just beyond the edges of his own quiet farm. But Kael's patient, respectful manner throughout the visit, his genuine efforts to answer every difficult question honestly, rather than deflecting with royal authority, gradually won over even her father's cautious skepticism. By the time they departed back toward the stronghold, her parents had extracted a promise of regular visits, and Elena felt, for the first time since the night of the blizzard, that the two halves of her life, the ordinary village girl she had always been, and the Luna she was becoming, might finally be woven together into something whole, rather than remaining painfully divided. Kael's own recovery from the physical wounds of the assassination attempt had long since completed, but Elena noticed something deeper healing in him as well throughout these weeks, a lightness returning to his manner that Garrett later confided had been largely absent during the years of quiet political tension that had simmered beneath Draven's hidden treachery. The weight of ruling alone, of carrying the full burden of his territory's security and stability without a true partner to share it, had clearly worn on him in ways he had never fully articulated, until Elena's presence began, gradually and naturally, to ease that isolation. Their bond continued to deepen through countless small, ordinary moments, rather than any single dramatic turning point. Quiet mornings spent walking the stronghold's terraces together, evenings spent in his study while he reviewed reports, and she assisted with correspondence, or simply sat nearby with her own quiet work. The comfortable, easy companionship of two people who had chosen each other freely, without the pressure of legend or obligation dictating that choice. Elena found herself more and more genuinely happy within this strange new life she had never imagined choosing, a happiness rooted not in the grandeur of her new position, but in the simple, steady presence of a partner who valued her exactly as she was. Several months after the ceremony, as winter began once again to settle over the mountains, Elena found herself standing at the same cliff face where she had first found Kael bleeding in the snow, having asked Garrett to guide her back to the location during a quiet afternoon when Kael himself was occupied with council business. She stood at the edge of the small overhang that had sheltered them both through that first desperate night, snow falling gently now rather than raging in blizzard fury, and felt a quiet, profound gratitude settle over her for the strange, unlikely chain of choices that had led her from that freezing night to the full, rich life she now carried. Kael found her there later that same afternoon, having finished his council business earlier than expected, and guessing, correctly, where she might have gone. He settled beside her at the cliff's edge, his hand finding hers as they both looked out over the snow-covered valley below, and asked, quietly, what had drawn her back to this particular place after so many months. Elena considered the question carefully before answering, watching the snow drift lazily down around them, so different from the violent chaos of that first storm. She told him that she had wanted to remember, clearly and deliberately, the exact moment everything had changed, not because the memory carried any lingering fear or regret, but because she wanted to honor the simple instinct that had guided her that night, the same instinct that continued to guide every choice she made now as Luna of this hidden, remarkable territory she had come to call home. She told him that she had never regretted, not for a single moment since that freezing night, the decision to follow the sound of a suffering creature into the storm, rather than walk on toward her own safety, and that everything which had followed, the danger, the uncertainty, the political turmoil, and finally the deep, steady happiness she now carried, had only confirmed for her that compassion, offered freely and without expectation of reward, remained the truest compass a person could follow, through even the darkest and most uncertain of storms. Cale listened to her words with quiet, evident emotion, and when she finished speaking, he drew her close against him, the warmth of his embrace a stark and welcome contrast to the biting cold that had once nearly claimed both their lives in this very spot. He told her that he had spent centuries ruling his territory, believing that duty and personal happiness existed as separate, often competing demands, one always requiring sacrifice of the other. Finding her, he said, had taught him otherwise, had shown him that the truest strength of a ruler came not from standing alone and untouched by personal connection, but from being anchored by someone whose own strength and compassion could steady him through every storm still to come. They stood together at the cliff's edge as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, two people bound not merely by ancient legend or a mark awakened through crisis, but by a genuine, deliberate choice to build a life together, forged through danger and doubt, and ultimately strengthened by both. Below them, nestled in its hidden valley, the stronghold's lights began to flicker on, one by one, against the gathering dusk, a community made stronger and more united through the trials of the past months, waiting to welcome its king and its Luna home. Elena took one last look at the small overhang where she had once fought through a long, freezing night to save a dying stranger's life, never imagining the full scope of what that single choice would eventually bring her, and felt, more clearly than ever before, a deep and settled certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged. As she and Cale turned together to make their way back down the mountain path toward the warm lights of home, the snow continued to fall gently around them, soft and peaceful, nothing at all like the violent storm that had first brought them together, and yet somehow, in its own quiet way, just as full of quiet, transformative wonder.